I want to start with a number, 1%. That's what's left of the forests in Australia. Not 90%, not 50, not even 20, 1%. And I want you to hold that number in your mind, because I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes asking you a very simple question that nobody, not the historians, not the land managers, not the ecologists writing their papers in their universities, has ever quite answered to my satisfaction. Why? Not how it happened, not when, not even who did it exactly. Those details are actually fairly well documented, which is itself a strange thing when you start pulling on this thread. No. The question I want to ask is the one hiding behind all those other questions. Why would you replace an infinite food system with a controlled one? About 3 years ago, I started looking into something that I initially thought was a footnote, a local history curiosity, the kind of thing you find on a regional council heritage page or in a faded pamphlet at a rural museum. I was researching colonial land clearing patterns in Australia. Dry subject, important, but dry. And I kept running into this phrase, the big scrub. It appeared in documents from the 1870s, the 1880s, the early 1890s. Settlers described it with awe and with fear. A subtropical rainforest covering approximately 75,000 hectares of the Richmond and Tweed river valleys in what is now northeastern New South Wales. Dense, ancient, stretching as far as any European eye had ever seen. A forest so thick that surveyors got lost inside it for days. A forest that, according to nearly every account I could find, was alive with food: figs, macadamia, finger lime, black bean, lily-pilly, Davidson's plum, quandong, jackwood, riberry, species upon species of edible plant, fruiting at staggered intervals across the seasons, creating what some botanists now tentatively describe as a perennial food system, something that, once established, could theoretically feed people indefinitely with no farming required. No ploughing, no irrigation, no soil degradation, an orchard, a continent-sized orchard. And then, within 30 years, it was gone. Not most of it, not the majority of it, 99% of it. By 1900, the big scrub had been reduced to a scattering of isolated fragments. By 1902, official surveys recorded less than 1% of the original forest remaining as intact vegetation. In under 3 decades, one of the most productive and complex food-producing ecosystems on Earth had been, for all practical purposes, eliminated. And here's where I first felt the familiar pull of something that didn't quite sit right. It happened so fast. Now, the official explanation is straightforward. Settlers needed farmland. Timber was valuable. The colonial government encouraged clearing. The cedar cutters came first, stripping the valuable timber, and the farmers followed behind them with axe and fire, turning the cleared ground over to dairy and sugar and banana farming. That explanation is technically accurate, but the deeper I went, the more that explanation began to feel like a frame around a much larger picture, a frame designed to direct your eye toward the obvious thing, and away from what's sitting just outside the edge. Because here's what the official story doesn't fully reckon with. The colonists weren't just clearing inconvenient wilderness. They were, in many cases, actively, urgently replacing a functioning food production system with a dependent one. The distinction matters enormously. A forest that produces food without human management is a forest that makes people free. A farm that requires seed, fertilizer, water management, market access, land ownership and government approval is a system that makes people dependent. This raises a simple but critical question. If the land was already producing food, why was the systematic destruction of that food-producing capacity treated not as a loss but as progress? And why did it happen, not gradually, not experimentally, but with a speed and totality that still takes the breath away when you look at the actual numbers? Let me give you another data point. The Australian red cedar, Tuna ciliata, called red gold by the colonial timber industry, a tree that could grow to 40 meters in height, with a trunk 3 meters in diameter. It grew in the rainforests of Queensland and New South Wales, and it was so abundant that early settlers described pulling logs from rivers that had floated down from the interior, the rivers themselves carrying timber to the coast. Within 50 years of British settlement in eastern Australia, the red cedar was, for commercial purposes, extinct. Not threatened, not reduced, commercially extinct. By 1880, cedar cutters were writing in their own journals about the impossibility of finding a mature specimen. Men who had spent their entire careers in the industry were reporting the complete exhaustion of a resource that had seemed inexhaustible just one generation prior. 50 years. One generation. An organism that had taken centuries, possibly millennia, to establish its distribution across a continent, gone in 50 years. And the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Not just once, not just in the big scrub, not just with the red cedar. Everywhere I looked in the colonial record of Australia, I found the same signature, a complex multi-species food-producing ecosystem, present in documented abundance, followed by a period of extraordinarily rapid and total elimination, followed by its replacement with a monoculture or simplified agricultural system that required management, capital and external inputs to function. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And here's the strangest part. When I started looking at what these forests actually were, not through a colonial ecological lens, but through the lens of what they produced, I found something that the mainstream historical narrative has never quite come to terms with. These weren't just wilderness. They weren't pristine, untouched, primordial forests in the way that the settler imagination understood wilderness. The more I read, the ethnobotanical surveys, the early observations of naturalists like Ludwig Leichhardt and Alan Cunningham, the later work of people like Bill Gamage and Bruce Pascoe, the more I found documentation of what can only be described as a managed landscape. Indigenous Australians had been tending these forests, actively, for tens of thousands of years, burning at specific intervals to encourage specific plants, moving seeds and cuttings, creating what ecologists now call forest gardens, deliberately constructed multi-story plant communities that mimicked natural forest structure but were optimized to produce food across every season of the year. Macadamia trees, which we now know were deliberately cultivated and spread by Aboriginal peoples through seed selection and planting, were found growing in patterns that some botanists have described as too regular to be natural. Bunya pines, producing massive cones of edible seeds, were distributed across ranges in a way that recent research suggests may reflect deliberate transplanting over thousands of years. Yam daisy fields, kangaroo grass meadows, wetland systems producing water lily seeds and tubers, not random, not accidental, designed, the word that keeps coming up in the research, very quietly, very carefully, is horticulture, not agriculture, not wilderness management, horticulture, deliberate food garden cultivation at continental scale across thousands of years. And the official history erased it. Not metaphorically, legally, terra nullius, land belonging to no one. It's a Latin phrase, 2 words, and those 2 words did something extraordinary in the history of Australia that I don't think we've ever fully accounted for. They didn't just dispossess people of their land. They erased the legal existence of the management systems that had made that land productive. Under terra nullius, as applied by British colonial law from 1788 onward, Australia was declared officially in legal doctrine to be effectively unoccupied, without sovereign inhabitants, without established land use, without property rights. This means something very specific and very strange when you start to think it through. It means that the most extensive food management system in the southern hemisphere, one that had been operating continuously for somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years, was declared by legal fiat to not exist, Not to be inferior, not to be less sophisticated, to not exist. The food forests were legally reclassified as wilderness the moment a British ship crossed the horizon. The cultivated macadamia groves became naturally occurring trees. The managed burning regimes became natural fire. The carefully maintained river systems became untamed waterways. And with that legal reclassification came something else. Something that I find, the deeper I look, harder and harder to describe as coincidence. The new owners were then legally obligated to improve the land. Under British common law and colonial land grant systems, terra nullius land had to be improved, made productive, made legible, made useful according to European definitions, or it could be seized back. You couldn't receive a land grant and simply harvest the existing food system. You had to clear it and farm it. The legal structure didn't just permit the destruction of Australia's food forests, it required it. I want to be careful here. I'm not claiming to know exactly what was understood by the people who wrote and applied those laws. I'm not naming a conspiracy or pointing at a specific meeting room where someone decided to erase continental-scale horticulture. What I'm saying is this. The legal instrument of terra nullius as applied had the effect, whether intended or not, of making the single largest food-producing landscape on Earth invisible, legally unprotectable, and actively destroyable. And then it created a legal framework that required its replacement with a controlled agricultural system. And the official explanation, settler hunger for farmland, timber economics, colonial ambition, doesn't explain why those particular legal instruments took precisely that shape, with precisely those effects, with precisely that speed. Because it wasn't just one forest, it was all of them. The Gondwana rainforests. This one still makes me stop when I think about it. These are some of the oldest forests on Earth. Remnants of the vegetation that covered Gondwana, the ancient supercontinent, before it broke apart more than 100 million years ago. Plant families so old they predate flowering plants as we know them. Living systems that survived the extinction event that killed the alleged dinosaurs. Current estimates suggest that at the time of European settlement in Australia, these ancient Gondwana lineage rainforests may have covered the majority of the continent in various forms. The patterns of species distribution, the seed dispersal records locked in paleo-ecological data, the distribution of rainforest soils, they all point toward coverage that would be, by modern standards, almost incomprehensible in scale. Today, what remains as formally recognised Gondwana rainforest is a series of fragmented patches, mostly on the Queensland-New South Wales border. The most commonly cited figure for remaining intact coverage relative to ancient extent is around 0.4%, less than half of 1%. Let me frame that differently. If you had a bank account with $10,000 in it and someone told you that your descendants 200 years from now would have $40 left, and that the remaining $9,960 had been spent in the first 30 years, you would ask some very serious questions about what happened in those 30 years. And then if someone told you that the $40 couldn't even buy food anymore because the economic system had been restructured to require a completely different currency, one that had to be purchased, managed and continuously paid for, you would start to wonder whether the original money had been the problem to begin with. Not destroyed, not depleted, not lost, replaced. That's the word that matters. Replaced with something that requires management, with something you can control. If you're finding this investigation interesting and you haven't already, consider subscribing. We cover material like this every week, and what's coming in the next 15 minutes is where this story gets genuinely difficult to explain away. The Brigalow Belt, named for Acacia harpophylla, the Brigalow wattle. This was once an extraordinary ecological system covering somewhere between 7 and 11 million hectares across central Queensland and northern New South Wales. And I want to be specific about what this system was because the way it's usually described as scrubland, as dry bush, fundamentally misrepresents its food productivity. The Brigalow ecosystem included a suite of edible and medicinally significant plants that Aboriginal communities had been utilising and managing for millennia. The brigalow itself produces seeds, its flowers produce nectar, and the dense thickets it forms create microhabitats for food animals. The associated species, baler, rosewood, leopardwood, gidgee, create a complex layered system with seasonal food availability across the entire year. It was not farmland, not in the European sense, but it was producing food continuously, without inputs, without management costs, without infrastructure. And then, in the 1960s and 1970s, the Queensland government began offering explicit financial incentives to clear it. Subsidised clearing, tax concessions, freeholding arrangements that rewarded landholders for converting native vegetation to pasture, government incentives to destroy a food-producing landscape. By the early 2000s, more than 80% of the brigalow belt had been cleared. Some studies put the figure higher. Entire communities of species that had co-evolved with this landscape over millions of years were pushed to the margins or beyond. And the official explanation? Beef production, grain farming, economic development. But here's the thing that stops me every time. At the exact same moment that governments were paying people to destroy a system that produced food for free, they were also building infrastructure to supply food to the same regions through retail and agricultural chains that required money. That required work. That required participation in an economic system. You destroy the free food, you replace it with purchased food, and then you call it development. This raises a simple but critical question. Development for whom? And then there's the Murray-Darling Basin. I've saved this one for a specific reason, because it is perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of what I'm trying to describe, and because the transformation it underwent represents something that, the deeper I went, became harder and harder to look at, without feeling that something important was being deliberately obscured. The Murray-Darling Basin is the largest river system in Australia. Its catchment covers over 1 million square kilometres, more than 14% of the entire continent. It is fed by the Great Dividing Range and drains eventually into the Southern Ocean through the Coorong. Before European settlement, it was a system of extraordinary ecological complexity. The river red gums, Eucalyptus camaldulensis, lined the waterways in forests that stretched for hundreds of kilometres. These trees are not just impressive, they are, from a food systems perspective, genuinely remarkable. Their flowers produce nectar in such quantities that Aboriginal peoples harvested honey at industrial scales. Their bark and wood were used for tools, canoes, shelter. The animals they supported, waterfowl, freshwater fish, mammals, reptiles, were food sources of extraordinary abundance. The river itself was thick with species. Murray cod, McCulloch, which can grow to 1.8 metres in length and live for 70 years, were reportedly so abundant in early colonial accounts that settlers described scooping them from the shallows. Freshwater crayfish, golden perch, silver perch, catfish, river mussels, and around the waterways, the floodplain ecosystems, seasonally inundated grasslands and swamp meadows produced seed harvests that some historical accounts suggest were processed on a near-industrial scale. Aboriginal peoples were harvesting grass seeds and making bread from the grains of native grasses in the Murray-Darling Basin for thousands of years before European arrival. Within one generation of settlement, this system was transformed, not gradually, not partially, totally. The river red gum forests were logged, first for railway sleepers, then for construction timber, then simply cleared. The flood regimes that sustained the floodplain ecosystems were regulated, redirected, controlled through weirs and locks and diversions. The fish were commercially harvested to near depletion. The wetlands were drained, and in their place, irrigated agriculture, cotton, rice, vineyards, orchards. not of the native food species that had grown there for millennia, but of introduced species requiring constant irrigation from the same rivers that had previously produced food for free. The water that had supported a self-sustaining food ecosystem was redirected into an infrastructure of controlled food production. And that infrastructure required ownership. It required licenses. It required economic participation. The silence was deafening. I looked for a serious historical analysis of this transition, not of its ecological effects, which have been documented extensively, but of the decision to replace a free food system with a dependent one. The economics of it, the logic of it, I found almost nothing. There are papers on deforestation, papers on irrigation efficiency, papers on the ecological decline of native species. But a serious, comprehensive reckoning with the question of why the most productive free food system on the continent was dismantled and replaced with one that required economic participation. Silence. Now, I want to step back for a moment because I know what some of you are thinking. This is just colonialism. This is just what colonial systems did. Settlers cleared land because they needed farmland, because timber was valuable, because they didn't understand what they were destroying. And I accept that as a framework. I genuinely do. The history of colonial land clearing in Australia is well documented, and it involves ignorance, greed, hunger, ambition, and systemic racism toward the indigenous peoples whose management systems were being erased. But here's what the "it was just colonialism" explanation doesn't account for: the speed, the totality, and the pattern. Because when I started pulling back from Australia and looking at what was happening in other parts of the world during the same period, the late 18th and 19th centuries, I found the same signature appearing with what I can only describe as unsettling regularity. The Black Forest of Germany, one of Europe's most productive forest food systems, cleared and replanted with monoculture timber production in the same period. The forests of the Amazon basin, well documented now, but the pattern of clearing and replacement with dependent agriculture follows the same arc. The old growth forests of the Pacific Northwest of North America, the forest gardens of the Great Lakes region, documented by European explorers and then systematically eliminated within decades of contact. The ancient food forests of the Sahel in West Africa, replaced with cash crop monocultures under colonial administration. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, continent after continent, hemisphere after hemisphere. Complex, multi-species, self-sustaining food systems that had been functioning and maintained for thousands of years, eliminated and replaced with controlled agriculture requiring external inputs, capital and market access. Not gradually, not regionally, everywhere, within roughly the same compressed historical window, and that's where the coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore. Because the official explanation for each of these events is local. It's always local. The British settlers in Australia needed farmland. The German foresters wanted timber revenue. The American agricultural companies wanted cotton land. Local explanations for local events. But when you put them together on a map, and when you look at the timeline, compressed into a historical window of roughly 1780 to 1920, accelerating dramatically in the mid-19th century, the local explanations start to feel insufficient. How do you get the same outcome on every inhabited continent within the same compressed time frame without some degree of coordination in the underlying legal, economic and institutional frameworks that drove those outcomes? The official explanation collapses here, not because any single event is inexplicable, but because the pattern, the worldwide pattern, is deeply difficult to explain through purely local, independent, coincidental processes. Here's what stays with me. The macadamia nut. You know the macadamia. You've probably eaten one. You probably paid somewhere between $20 and $40 a kilogram for the processed packaged version. The macadamia originated in the subtropical rainforests of southeastern Queensland and northeastern New South Wales, which is to say, in the very forests that became the big scrub. Aboriginal peoples of those regions had been harvesting, processing, trading, and, this part is important, deliberately cultivating and distributing macadamia for at least 10,000 years. They knew where every tree was. They knew when it would fruit. They knew how to crack the notoriously hard shell with specific stones. They had seasonal ceremonies organised around the harvest. And when British settlers arrived in those same forests, they didn't eat macadamia, or rather, they ate it, recorded it approvingly, noted that it was delicious and nutritious, and then continued clearing the forest where it grew. The macadamia wasn't commercially cultivated for export until the 1880s, and not in its home range, in Hawaii of all places, where it was introduced as an ornamental and then belatedly recognised as a food crop. Let that sit for a moment. The people who cleared the forest where the macadamia grew, eradicating the food management system that produced it, then had to import it from Hawaii 100 years later and pay a premium for it. Not ignorance, not accident, not economic inefficiency, but the systematic replacement of a system that gave you macadamia for free with a system that charges you $40 a kilogram for macadamia that came back from across the Pacific. Why? The evidence suggests something much larger than simple land clearing. What I keep coming back to, what I find myself unable to explain away, is the question of dependency. A person who can walk into a forest and find food does not need to buy food. They do not need to sell their labour to afford food. They do not need to participate in a wage economy or a property system or a retail infrastructure. A free food forest is, in a very specific economic sense, a threat to the architecture of economic control. And what was built in the place of Australia's food forests? An agricultural system that required, and I want to be precise about this, that required land ownership, capital investment, seed purchasing, fertiliser application, water rights, market access, transport infrastructure, and ultimately retail participation. You need money to operate within the replacement system in a way you did not need money to operate within the original one. And here's what the official history of Australian settlement almost never seriously addresses. The people it dispossessed were not poor people in the way that European settlers were poor. They were not poor in the way that people in agricultural economies are poor, meaning without money. They existed in a different relationship to resources entirely, one where the land itself was the larder and the question was never, can I afford to eat, but simply, which of the many available things shall I eat today? The legal instrument of terra nullius didn't just deny them property rights, it denied the legibility of their relationship to the land. It made their form of wealth legally invisible and therefore legally destroyable. And once it was destroyed, the people who had lived within it had no choice but to enter a system in which they were, by design and by the devastation of their knowledge systems, at a profound disadvantage. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. If you're watching this and feeling the pull of this research, there's more depth in our community. Leave a comment. Share what you think we're missing. The best discoveries in this space have come from people bringing pieces that others haven't found. The deeper I went into this, the more I found a particular kind of absence that I've started thinking of as structured silence. It's not that the information doesn't exist. Bits of it are everywhere. In the journals of early naturalists, in the ethnobotanical surveys, in the oral histories of indigenous communities where they've survived and where people have been allowed to record them, in the scattered papers of ecologists who found in degraded landscapes the botanical signatures of what had once been there, but it exists in fragments, scattered across disciplines that don't often talk to each other, siloed into ethnobotany or agricultural history or environmental law or indigenous studies, rarely brought together into a coherent picture of what was lost and why. And when those fragments are brought together, the picture that emerges is genuinely startling. Australia, at the time of European contact, appears to have been one of the most sophisticated food production landscapes on Earth. Not in the way that a wheat field is sophisticated, not through the annual destruction and replanting of a single species, but through the accumulation of ecological intelligence across thousands of generations. Through the deliberate arrangement of species in patterns that created food abundance across every season, that survived drought and flood because of their diversity, that required no external inputs because they had evolved in that specific place over millions of years. The Gondwana rainforests, 0.4% remaining, were not just old trees. They were a pharmaceutical library, an agricultural seed bank, and a food forest of continental proportions. The big scrub, 1% remaining, was not just a picturesque landscape. It was a managed food garden that had been maintained and optimized for longer than the oldest continuously operating agricultural civilization in the world. The Murray-Darlings River red gum forests, degraded beyond recognition, their flood regimes destroyed, their fish populations collapsed, were not just riparian fringe. They were the connective tissue of the continent's most productive freshwater food system, and the Brigalow Belt, 80% cleared, the rest heavily degraded, was not scrubland. It was a complex and productive ecological system that had been supporting human communities for tens of thousands of years. All of it gone. Within one historical generation, replaced with a system of controlled food production that required money, management, ownership, and participation in a structure that somebody somewhere was operating at the top of. I want to close with a question that I genuinely don't have an answer to. Not a rhetorical question. A real one. What did they know? Not the settlers with their axes, not the timber companies with their teams, not even the colonial administrators with their legal instruments and their land grants and their improvement clauses. What did whoever designed those systems know about what was being erased? Because here's the thing about the knowledge that lived in these forests. The knowledge of when to burn, where to plant, which species to move and which to leave, how to read the seasonal signals, how to tend a landscape across decades and centuries and millennia. That knowledge didn't live in books. It didn't live in archives. It lived in people, in communities, in ceremony, in the accumulated practice of generations. And when the people were dispossessed, when the communities were broken apart, when the ceremonies were outlawed, as they were, formally and explicitly, in Australian colonial and later federal policy, that knowledge didn't transfer to archives. It disappeared. You can't look it up. You can't recover it from a library. Some of it is being painstakingly reconstructed by indigenous communities and their collaborators, but the depth of what existed, the full complexity of a 65,000-year ecological intelligence may be, for all practical purposes, irretrievable. And that is a very specific kind of loss, not like losing a language, not like losing an artwork, like losing the operating instructions for a system that you've already destroyed. The system is gone, the instructions are gone, and what replaced them is a structure of food production that is, by every measurable metric, less resilient, less diverse, less sustainable, and more dependent than what it replaced. How does that happen? How does that happen on every continent, within the same compressed historical window, through legal instruments that seem almost deliberately designed to make free food systems invisible and destroyable? I don't know. I genuinely do not know. What I know is that the big scrub once covered 75,000 hectares and is now 1% of that. I know that Australia's red cedar was commercially extinct within 50 years of settlement. I know that the Brigalow Belt was cleared with government money. I know that the Gondwana rainforests, as old as the dinosaurs if you believe in them, older than the flowering plants, are now 0.4% of their former extent. I know that the Murray-Darlings' ancient food-producing river systems were transformed within a single generation into an infrastructure of controlled agriculture. I know that Terra Nullius legally erased the existence of the management systems that created and maintained those landscapes. And I know that what replaced them requires your money, your labour, your participation in a structure you did not design and do not control. Those are the facts. The interpretation, the why, remains in the official record almost entirely unasked, and the silence when you start listening for it is deafening.